In this video, we will explain how the practice of indentured servitude failed to solve the colonial labor problem and why colonists then turned to African slavery. We'll also describe the character of slavery in the early English colonies and explain how a distinctive African American identity and culture emerged from mingling of numerous American African ethnic groups. By the late 17th century, large numbers of discontented freemen roamed the Chesapeake colonies, looking for work, their own land, and single women to marry. The merchant planters feared these restless freemen as potential threats to property and the established social order. In Virginia, the Legislative Assembly reacted to these fears by disenfranchising landless citizens in 1670. Still, as long as colonial officials ruled for the general good, settlers accepted the established social hierarchy and the inequality it perpetrated. In 1676, a dispute over Virginia's Indian policy racked the Chesapeake, sparking civil war against Governor William Berkeley. Led by Nathaniel Bacon, about 1,000 Virginians rebelled against the governor's friendly policies towards Native Americans and the fur trade monopoly he controlled. Bacon, seen here in this picture, was a young planter who was also angered by renewed Indian attacks against white settlers on the frontier, the only place that the freemen could find cheap arable land was on the frontier, and Berkeley was not giving them any protection against Native American attacks. Governor Berkeley refused to retaliate against the Native Americans for fear of interrupting the lucrative fur trade, which helped give him money and line his pockets. Against Berkeley's orders, Bacon and his rebels retaliated, attacking the Native Americans, chasing Berkeley from Jamestown, and burning Jamestown to the ground. Bacon and his followers ravaged Virginia before the militia put down the uprising. Bacon himself died of disease before he could be caught. Most of his followers melted away back to their homes. The militia caught some rebels, and more than 20 were hanged. Bacon's rebellion left behind a legacy of hostility between the Chesapeake planter elites and the large numbers of freemen, a factor that prompted the planters to look for a more controllable, less threatening source of labor. As many as 10 million African slaves would begin to be transported to the New World within 300 years of Columbus's landing in 1492. About 400,000 were sold in North America, 95% to buyers in the South. Most slaves sold in North America arrived after 1700, and approximately 15% were imported into the South, came through the West Indies first. The Spanish and Portuguese monopolized much of the early slave trade, hauling their cargoes to the West Indies and to South America. However, it was the Dutch who first introduced African slaves to North America. In 1619, a Dutch warship sold 20 slaves to buyers in Jamestown. By 1670, there were approximately 2,000 slaves in Virginia, out of a total population of nearly 35,000. The high cost of African slaves convinced most planters to contract for less costly indentured servants. Three factors intervened to influence the cost of labor and the slave trade. The first was Bacon's rebellion in 1676. The second was rising wages in England during the 1680s, which convinced more potential emigrants to stay in England. And the third was that the Royal African Company lost its slave trade monopoly in 1698. When the monopoly was lost, Rhode Islanders and others entered the slave trade, a factor which increased the supply and pushed prices for slaves down. By 1750, African slaves comprised nearly half of Virginia's population. In South Carolina, slaves outnumbered white settlers 2-1. Most slaves in the southern colonies came from Africa's west coast. Angolans, Gambians, Bambaras, Mandingas, Ingbos, Akans, Asantes, and other tribal cultures. During the Middle Passage, mortality rates varied, but averaged between 15 and 20%. The Middle Passage is the term used for the trip from Africa to the West Indies, which was the most difficult part of the passage. They were captured by African coastal tribes during raids or warfare against other African tribes. Slaves were taken to markets on the beaches where European and American slave traders purchased them. Slaves who survived the Middle Passage to America were then sold at auction in ports like Charleston, South Carolina, or Newport, Rhode Island. A few of the earliest African slaves in the Chesapeake and southern colonies gained their freedom, and some of them became planters and slave owners as well. This picture is a picture of a slave ship. Inside, you can see how tightly packed the slaves were in the holding area. This is a clearer picture of how slaves might be transported along a slave ship. By the late 17th century, white planters reacted to rapidly increasing numbers of African slaves living among them by enacting slave codes and limiting the practice of freeing slaves. For example, in 1662, Virginia's legislature passed slave codes, which decreed slaves and their children were chattel for the life of their white masters, property that could be willed to others. Some plantation colonies passed statutes making it a crime to teach a slave to read or write. Laws intended to make communication and the spread of ideas between slaves more difficult, as well as to hinder escapes. Masters preferred African slaves to indentured servants because slaves were owned and served for life, and because colonial laws did not restrict the force that masters could use in punishing slaves for infractions. Africans resisted life under slavery by working slow, sabotaging tools and machinery, committing acts of petty theft against their masters, running away, committing violent acts of resistance or rebellion, which were rare and very rarely never successful in the long term. In 1712, a slave rebellion in New York City led to the killing of dozens of whites and the execution of 21 slaves. In 1739, the Stono River Rebellion in South Carolina, approximately 20 slaves attacked a country store, seized a cache of guns, and made a run for Spanish Florida, killing 20 men before being stopped by militia. In the Upper South, in the Chesapeake, tobacco colonies, slaves were very closely supervised by whites. Their work was also physically less demanding than that of slaves working on rice, indigo, or sugarcane plantations. In the Upper South, plantations were generally located closely together, permitting slaves more frequent contact with their relatives and friends. Plantations in the Lower South grew rice, indigo, and sugarcane and were more isolated. Slaves there had less interaction with slaves on other plantations. Rapid growth of the slave population in the Chesapeake area was due to the Atlantic slave trade, its own fertility and natural increase, making it one of the few slave societies in world history to perpetuate itself. As a consequence of natural increase, native-born African slaves managed to create a stable and unique slave culture, a combination of African and American elements for religion, language, and folk customs. On the Sea Islands off South Carolina's coast, several African languages, including Yoruba, Igbo, Hasabo, ended to produce Gullah, and a distinctively new language. African languages also influenced American speech, introducing new words like voodoo, gumbo, and goober to our vocabulary. Other elements of African culture contributed to American life, including the West African ring shout dance, which led to the development of jazz and musical instruments such as the banjo and the bongo drum.